So I was talking before about Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge and how it moves through these different genres and how that ultimately sort of works out in overcoming this challenge of writing about a topic where it's people just staring at screens and so on for hours and hours, and that's the sort of action of this sort of high tech world. But it goes through different things like detective genre and elements from cyberpunk that draw on the detective genre and draw on his own work, and so that works out. And I wanted to look at a somewhat more of a negative example, and I don't even strictly want to call this a negative example overall because it was entertaining enough. It kept me sort of gripped reading along through the novel. But Anyone by Charles Soule came out back in December, and so it's a novel about characters can swap over into someone else's body through the sort of technology, and it shifts back and forth between the present day where the technology is being developed and the future where it's sort of become mainstream. There's a big mega corporation that runs it, and the entire global economy is based on this technology. And so the thing is, so writers do these sorts of shortcuts using word is sort of known from other works, what sort of people expect. And so the context of this is the idea of virtual surrogacy, where you can become anyone else in a virtual sense online on your computer. And so that's the selling point of the technology in the novel is, oh, you can become anyone else. And it's made much more literal, much more physical. You actually go into their body, you become them, you walk, around as them. So there are these moments of laziness within the narrative. So one instance, two characters go to a dive bar, and it's described explicitly as one character as something where he had figured that these were gone from the city entirely for decades. It should be something very rare, possibly not even there at all. The brick building is described as being like a rotten tooth sticking out on the sort of gleaming, metal that is the rest of the block, all the sort of fancy, redone, high-tech city. And, so they go in, and at first he wonders, is this like a theme park? Is this real? And they go in, and it's like, oh, it is very real, and you could tell people have puked and pissed here and drank here for years. And the description is sort of right what you would expect from, say an older detective story about, the gritty criminal dive bar in the middle of what seems like otherwise a nice area. And this is where the real information is. So these scenes end up replacing what would otherwise be explorations of the sort of technological context. And so another example, two characters end up video chatting. One threatens the other by pulling out a switchblade, and the other person is described as suddenly being overcome with fear and awe, and he starts sort of stuttering and says, oh, okay, I'll do what you want. But the threat isn't actually real because they're not actually there together. The switchblade can't do anything to him over the sort of remote connection. But you have these sort of expectations of, people going around to dive bars, threatening people with switchblades and so on. And so you have this high-tech facade, but what is keeping the narrative going, what is keeping the excitement going page by page is, this sort of older standards of narrative development, these sort of older standards of action and so on. The justification for having these sorts of scenes is that sort of theme park idea that was presented in the dive bar passage where, it's not actually a theme park in the narrative, but it functions like that for the reader, where it's just you have this fun moving through these different sort of genre cliches. And so it's this shortcut where you have this complex new set of questions, this sort of technological framework, but instead of focusing on that, you show what you know from your own reading, what you know your readers will expect from reading older things. So behind me I have the prequel volume of The Surrogates, though I wanted to talk about the original. This is a sort of comparative work where the sort of context of anyone is these sorts of narratives about technology and surrogate bodies and so on. And so you have as well also altered carbon, for instance, and the surrogates. But these are where you have these sort of artificial robotic bodies, whatever they are. Anyone is just like, people are born, we have our normal world, but you could just hop into someone else's body and sort of hijack it. And so the corporation regulates all of that. But the novel also gets to look at the sort of gritty criminal underworld where you have a sort of darknet version that's off the grid. And so the publisher for Anyone describes the novel as this sort of crossover between Blade Runner and Get Out. And so the latter is setting it up as, you have this history of body snatcher narratives, and so that's another thing it's feeding into. So the technological end of things is signaled through that reference to Blade Runner, but there's even this passage in Anyone where it's explicitly this comparison where it says, in the 2010s, all of a sudden, cell phones were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. Everyone was using them all the time. And it was the same thing with the Flash, this technology of jumping into other people's bodies. It just sort of grew rapidly, and all of a sudden everyone was using it. That was the whole global economy. That was the world. And they don't really develop that idea extensively. And so what you have in The Surrogates, for instance, is a story about a detective who, most people are using surrogate bodies for most of their life, police especially, and so someone's going around trying to shut down this whole surrogate network. And so the detective, his surrogate body is destroyed, and he decides to continue the rest of the investigation in the flesh. And it's the sort of exploration of, the sort of technological world and what it sort of means to be able to use these sort of surrogates and escape your own life. And so what it achieves through, a fairly tight story and through some of the sort of visual work is it really sort of keeps it consistently close to exploring that parallel and the sort of dynamics of our world, where what happens sort of socially and personally and sort of on a sort of psychological level, philosophical level, in terms of that sort of exchange between ourselves and the sort of technological replacement. But Anyone has this sort of vague idea that, maybe if you could become anyone else, and so you see someone's body, but that's not really them, they're sort of just piloting it temporarily, that it might remove some sort of biases, such as with race, that you wouldn't see someone and judge them based on how they look, because they could be anyone. But that doesn't really carry through very well when that parallel isn't made, where we have now decades of experience with this world of virtual surrogacy. And so this is something that I was excited about when I picked up Anyone, where what it has over Altered Carbon, what it has over The Surrogates, is that those came out in the early 2000s. But now, we've been living in this world for much longer. We've seen much more deeply the sort of highs and lows of what this means. And so I thought the novel would really grapple with that, but it actually goes much further away and sort of just takes it on as this fun little conceit where someone can get into all sorts of hijinks and just hop from body to body and, throw someone else into a rat body or something. And so, it makes for a fun read, but what is lost is that real exploration of those themes, where you look into this whole idea of the sort of virtual surrogacy. So while anyone is fun to read, it sort of falls flat on a sort of ideas level. And part of what I think makes Surrogates work is it's based on an existing memoir of mid 90s internet communities and being online in that time, and the internet addiction in that time. And so it's drawing on real world concrete examples, and in particular even older forms of this, not even just looking at what's going on in the mid 2000s or in looking ahead to what's sort of coming, but really the fundamentals of what is going on in these experiences where you go on a computer, you go online, and you are virtually someone else. But with anyone, it's just sort of the fun of being able to go to different locations, being able to jump around. I have an essay in this book by me, Cyberpunk and Visual Culture, that gets into that work and the visual elements from Brett Veldel and how it really sort of expresses these sorts of technological dynamics between characters and the sense of disconnect and issues of the imagination and really understanding themselves and each other within this sort of idea of virtual surrogacy. But anyone sort of doesn't really hold up in that way. And so the thing ultimately is about how you have these shortcuts, and in Bleeding Edge, for instance, it's not that, Thomas Pynchon is just totally creating this whole new world and everything's this original invention and so on. You have, these elements that take place in the sort of crafting of novels and narratives, but there are more or less effective ways of really grappling with the reality of the sort of digital era. And so Anyone was a fun enough read, but it didn't do what I was hoping it would do, which is really sort of take advantage of its 2019 vantage point and really show what's going on with the experience of people, actually living in this world. And so, I want to keep looking at different examples and exploring this dynamic of how different writers have crafted different sort of narratives around this technology and what they do in doing so.